Chapter 10. When the truck had gone, loaded with implements, with heavy tools, with beds and springs, with every movable object that might be sold, Tom hung around the place. He moved into the barn shed, into the empty stalls, and he walked into the implement lean-to, and kicked the refuse that was left, turned a broken mower tooth with his foot. He visited places he remembered, the red bank where the swallows nested, the willow tree over the pig pen. 2 shoats grunted and squirmed at him through the fence, black pigs, sunning and comfortable. And then his pilgrimage was over, and he went to sit on the doorstep where the shade was lately fallen. Behind him, Ma moved about in the kitchen, washing children's clothes with a bucket, and her strong freckled arms dripped soap suds from the elbows. She stopped her rubbing when he sat down. She looked at him a long time, and at the back of his head, when he turned and stared out at the hot sunlight. And then she went back to her rubbing. She said, "Tom, I hope things is all right in California." He turned to her and looked at her. "What makes you think they ain't?" he asked. "Well, nothing. Seems too nice, kinda. I seen the handmills fellas pass out, and how much work they is, and high wages and all. And I seen in the paper how they want folks to come and pick grapes and oranges and peaches. That'd be nice work, Tom, pickin' peaches. Even if they wouldn't let you eat none, you could maybe snitch a little ratty one sometime. And it'd be nice under the trees, working in the shade. I'm scared of stuff so nice. I ain't got faith. I'm scared something ain't so nice about it," Tom said. "Don't rouse your faith bird high, and you won't do no crawlin' with the worms." "I guess that's right. That's scripture, ain't it?" "I guess so," said Tom. "I never could keep scripture straight since I read a book named The Winning of Barbara Worth." Ma chuckled lightly, and scrounged the clothes in and out of the bucket. She wrung out overalls and shirts, and the muscles of her forearms quartered out. "Your pa's pa, he quoted scripture all the time. He got it all rolled up, too. It was the Doctor's Miles almanac he got mixed up. Used to read every word in that almanac out loud, letters from folks that he couldn't sleep or had lame backs. And later he'd give them people for a lesson, and he'd say, 'That's a parable from the scripture.' Your pa and Uncle John troubled him some about it when they'd laugh." She piled the wrung clothes like a cord of wood on the table. "They say it's 2,000 miles where we're going. How far you think that is, Tom? I seen it on a map. Big mountains, like on a postcard, and we're going right through 'em. How long you suppose it'll take that to go that far, Tommy?" "I don't know," he said. 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if we got luck. Look, Ma, stop your worrying. I'm gonna tell you something about being in the pen. You can't go thinking about what when you're gonna be out. You go nuts. You gotta think about that day, and then the next day, about the ball game Saturday. That's what you gotta do. Old timers does that. A new young fella gets butting his head over on the cell door. He's thinking how long it's gonna be. Why ain't you doing that? Just take every day. That's a good way," she said, and she filled up her bucket with hot water from the stove, and she put on dirty clothes and began punching them down into the soapy water. "Yes, that's a good way. But I like to think how nice it's gonna be, maybe, in California. Never cold, and fruit every place. And people just being in the nicest places, like little white houses in among the orange trees. I wonder, that is, if we all get jobs and all work, maybe we can get one of them little white houses. And the little fellas go out and pick oranges right off the tree. They ain't gonna be able to stand it. They'll get into yelling so." Tom watched her working, and his eyes smiled. "It done you good just thinking about it. I knowed a fellow from California. He didn't talk like us. You'd have known he'd come from some far-off place, just the way he talked. But he said there's too many folks looking for work right there now. And he says the folks that pick the fruit live in dirty old camps and don't hardly get enough to eat. He says wages is low and hard to get any. A shadow crossed her face. "Oh, that ain't so," she said. "Your father got a handbill on the yellow paper telling how they need folks to work. They wouldn't go to that trouble if there wasn't plenty of work. Cost them good money to get handbills out. What'd they want to lie for? And costing him money to lie." Tom shook his head. "I don't know, Ma. It's kind of hard to think why they done it. Maybe," he looked at the hot sun shining on the red earth. "Maybe what? Maybe it's nice, like he says. Where'd Grandpa go?" Where'd the preacher go?" Ma was going out of the house, her arms loaded high with the clothes. Tom moved aside to let her pass. "Preacher says he's gonna walk her around. Grandpa's sleeping here in the house. He comes in here in the days and lays down sometimes." She walked to the line and began to drape pale blue jeans and blue shirts and long gray underwear over the wire. Behind him, Tom heard a shuffling step, and he turned to look in. Grandpa was emerging from the bedroom, and as in the morning, he fumbled with the buttons of his fly. "I heerd talking," he said. "Sons of bitches won't let an old fellow sleep. When you bastards get dry behind the ears, you'll maybe learn to let an old fellow sleep." His furious fingers managed to flip open the only buttons on his fly that had been buttoned, and his hand forgot what it had been trying to do. His hand reached in and contentedly scratched under the testicles. Ma came in with wet hands, and her palms puckered and bloated from hot water and soap. "Thought you was sleeping. Here, let me button you up." And though he struggled, she held him and buttoned his underwear and his fly, and his shirt and his fly. "You go around a sight," she said, and let him go. He spluttered angrily. "Fellas come to a nice when somebody buttons them. I want to be let be to button my own pants." Ma said playfully, "They don't let people run around with their clothes unbuttoned in California." "They don't, hey? Well, I'll show 'em. They think that they're gonna show me how to act out there. Why, I'll go around hanging out if I wanna." Ma said, "Seems like his language gets worse every year. Showing off, I guess." The old man thrust out his bristly chin and regarded Ma with his shrewd, mean, merry eyes. "Well, sir," he said, "we'll be startin' for long now. And by God, they's grapes out there, just a-hangin' over into the road. Know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna pick me a wash tub full of grapes, and I'm gonna set in 'em and scrooge around and let the juice run down my pants." Tom laughed. "By God, if he lives to be 200, you will never get Grandpa house broke." And he said, "You're all set on going, ain't you, Grandpa?" The old man pulled out a box and sat down heavily on it. "Yes, sir," he said, "and goddamn near time, too. My brother went on out there 40 years ago. Never did hear nothing about him. Sneaky son of a bitch he was. Nobody loved him. Run off with a single-action Colt of mine. If I ever run across him or his kids, if he got any out in California, I'll ask them for that Colt. But if I know him and he got any kids, he cuckooed him and somebody else is a-raising him. I sure will be glad to get out there. Got a feeling it'll make a new fella out of me. Go right to work in the fruit." Ma nodded. "He means it, too. Worked right up," she said. "Worked right up to 3 months ago when he throwed his hip out the last time." "Damn right," said Grandpa. Tom looked outward from his seat on the doorstep. "Here comes that preacher. walking around from the back side of the barn. Ma said, "Curiousest grace I ever heard that he give this morning. Wasn't hardly no grace at all, just talking, but the sound of it was like a grace." "He's a funny fella," said Tom. "Talks funny all the time. Seems he's talking to himself, though. He ain't trying to put nothing over." "Watch the look in his eyes," said Ma. "He looks baptized. Got that look they call looking around, looking through. He sure looks baptized, and a walking with his head down, a staring at nothing on the ground. There is a man that's baptized." And she was silent, for Casey had drawn near the door. "You're gonna get sun-shook walking around like that," said Tom. Casey said, "Well, yeah, maybe." He appealed to them all suddenly, to Ma and Grandpa and Tom. "I gotta get going west. I gotta go. I wonder if I can go along with you folks." And then he stood, embarrassed by his own speech. Ma looked at Tom to speak because he was a man, but Tom did not speak. She let him have the chance that was his right, and then she said, "Why, we'd be proud to have you. Of course I can't say that right now. Pa says the men will talk tonight and figure when we gonna start. I guess maybe we better not say till all the men come. John and Pa and Noah and Tom and Grandpa and Al and Connie. They're gonna figure soon they get back. But if they's room, I'm pretty sure we'll be proud to have you." The preacher sighed. "I'll go anyway. Something's happening. I went up and looked, and the house is all empty, and the land is empty, and this whole country is empty. I can't stay here no more. I gotta go where the folks is going. I'll work in the field, and maybe I'll be happy." "Aren't you gonna, and you ain't gonna preach?" Tom asked. "I ain't gonna preach." "And you ain't gonna baptize?" Mom asked. "I ain't gonna baptize. I'm gonna work in the fields, in the green fields, and I'm gonna be near to folks. I ain't gonna try to teach 'em nothing. I'm gonna try to learn. Gonna learn why the folks walking in the grass. Gonna hear 'em talk. Gonna hear 'em sing. Gonna listen to the kids eating mush. Gonna hear husband and wife pounding the mattress in the night. Gonna eat with them and learn." His eyes were wet and shining. "Gonna lay in the grass, open and honest with anybody that'll have me. Gonna cuss and swear and hear all the poetry folks talking. All that's holy, all that's what I didn't understand. All them things is the good things." The preacher sat humbly down on the chopping block beside the door. "I wonder what they is for a fella so lonely." Tom coughed delicately. "For a fella that don't preach no more," he began. "Oh, I'm a talker," said Casey. "No getting away from that, but I ain't preaching. Preaching is telling folks stuff. I'm asking them. That ain't preaching, is it?" "I don't know," said Tom. "Preaching's a kind of tone in a voice, and preaching's a way of looking at things. Preaching's been good to folks when they want to kill yourself for it. Last Christmas in McAllister, Salvation Army come and done us good. 3 solid hours of cornet music, and we sat there. They was being nice to us too. But if one of us tried to walk out, we'd a drawed solitary. That's preaching. Doing good to a fella that's down and can't smack you in the puss for it. No, you ain't no preacher, but don't you blow no cornets around here." Ma threw some sticks into the stove. "I'll get you a bite now, but it ain't much." Grandpa brought his box outside and sat on it and leaned against the wall, and Tom and Casey leaned back against the house wall, and the shadow of the afternoon moved out from the house. In the late afternoon, the truck came back, bumping and rattling through the dust, and there was a layer of dust in the bed, and the hood was covered with dust, and the headlights were obscured with a red flower. The sun was setting when the truck came back, and the earth was bloody in its setting light. Alice sat bent over the wheel, proud and serious and efficient, and Pa and Uncle John, as befitted the heads of the clan, had the honor seats beside the driver. Standing in the truck bed, holding onto the bars of the sides, rode the others, 12-year-old Ruthie and 10-year-old Winfield, grime-faced and wild, their eyes tired but excited, their fingers and the edges of their mouths black and sticky from licorice whips, whined out of their father in town. Ruthie, dressed in a real dress of pink muslin that came down below her knees, was a little serious in her young ladiness. But Winfield was still a little trifle of a snot nose, a little of a brooder back of the barn, and an inveterate collector and smoker of snipes. And where Ruthie felt the might, the responsibility, and the dignity of her developing breast, Winfield was kid wild and cowfish. Behind them, clinging lightly to the bars, stood Rose of Sharon. She balanced, swaying on the balls of her feet, and took up the road shock in her knees and her hams. For Rose of Sharon was pregnant and careful, her hair braided and wrapped around her head. She made an ash-blonde crown. Her round, soft face, which had been voluptuous and inviting a few months ago, had already put on the barrier of pregnancy. The self-sufficient smile, the knowing perfection look, and her plump body, full soft breasts and stomach, hard hips and buttocks that had swung so freely and provocatively as to invite slapping and stroking. Her whole body had become demure and serious. Her whole thought and action were directed inward on the baby. She balanced on her toes now, for the baby's sake, and the world was pregnant to her. She thought only in the terms of reproduction and of motherhood. Connie, her 19-year-old husband, who had married a plump, passionate hoyden, was still frightened and bewildered at the change in her, for there were no more catfights in bed, biting and scratching with muffled giggles and final tears. There was a balanced, careful, wise creature who smiled shyly, but very firmly at him. Connie was proud and fearful of Rose of Sharon. Whenever he could, he put a hand on her or stood close, so that his body touched her at hip and shoulder, and he felt that this kept a relation that might be departing. He was a sharp-faced, lean young man of a Texas strain, and his pale blue eyes were sometimes dangerous and sometimes kindly, and sometimes frightened. He was a good hard worker, and would make a good husband. He drank enough, but not too much, fought when it was required of him, and never boasted. He sat quietly in a gathering, and yet managed to be there and to be recognized. Had he not been 50 years old, and so one of the natural rulers of the family, Uncle John would have preferred not to sit in the honor place beside the driver. He would have liked Rose of Sharon to sit there. This was impossible, because she was young and a woman. But Uncle John sat uneasily. His lonely, haunted eyes were not at ease, and his thin, strong body was not relaxed. Nearly all the time, the barrier of loneliness cut Uncle John off from people and from appetites. He ate little, drank nothing, and was celibate. Underneath, his appetites swelled into pressures until they broke through. Then he would eat of some craved food until he was sick, or he would drink Jake or whiskey until he was a shaken paralytic with red wet eyes, or he would raven with lust for some whore in salsa. It was told of him that once he went clear to Shawnee and hired 3 whores in one bed and snorted and rutted on their unresponsive bodies for an hour. But when one of his appetites was sated, he was sad and ashamed and lonely again. He hid from people, and by gifts tried to make up to all people for himself. Then he crept into houses and left gum under pillows for children. Then he cut wood and took no pay. Then he gave away any possession he might have, a saddle, a horse, a new pair of shoes. One could not talk to him then, for he ran away, if confronted, hid within himself and peeked out of frightened eyes. The death of his wife, followed by months of being alone, had marked him with guilt and shame and had left an unbreaking loneliness in him. But there were things he could not escape. Being one of the heads of the family, he had to govern, and now he had to sit on the honor seat beside the driver. The three men on the seat were glum as they drove toward home over the dusty road. Al, bending over the wheel, kept shifting his eyes from the road to the instrument panel, watching the ammeter needle, which jerked suspiciously, watching the oil gauge and the heat indicator. And his mind was cataloging weak points and suspicious things about the car. He listened to the whine, which might be the rear end, dry, and he listened to the tappets lifting and falling. He kept his hand on the gear lever, feeling the turning gears through it, and he let the clutch out against the brake to test for slipping clutch plates. He might be a musking goat sometimes, but this was his responsibility. This truck, its running, and its maintenance. If something went wrong, it would be his fault, and while no one would say it, everyone, and Al most of all, would know it was his fault. So he felt it, watched it, and listened to it, and his face was serious and responsible, and everyone respected him and his responsibility. Even Pa, who was the leader, would hold a wrench and take orders from Al. They were all tired on the truck. Ruthie and Winfield were tired from seeing too much movement, too many faces, from fighting to get licorice whips, tired from the excitement of having Uncle John secretly slip gum into their pockets. And the men in the seat were tired and angry and sad, for they had gotten $18 for every movable thing from the house, the horses, the wagon, the implements, and all the foreign furniture from the house. $18. They had assailed the buyer, argued, but they were routed when his interest seemed to flag, and he had told them he didn't want the stuff at any price. They were beaten, believed him, and took $2 less than he had first offered. And now they were wary and frightened because they had gone against a system they did not understand, and it had beaten them. They knew the team and the wagon were worth much more. They knew the buyer man would get much more, but they didn't know how to do it. Merchandising was a secret to them. Al, his eyes darting from the road to the panel board, said, "That fella, he ain't a local fella. Didn't talk like a local fella. Clothes was different, too." And Pa explained, "When I was in the hardware store, I talked to some men I know. They say there's fellas coming in just to buy up the stuff us fellas got to sell when we get out. They say these new fellas cleaning up, but there ain't nothing we can do about it." Maybe Tommy should have went. Maybe he could have did better. John said, "But the fellow wasn't going to take it all. We couldn't haul it back. These men I know told about that. Said the buyer fella's always done that. Scared folks that way. We just don't know how to go about stuff like that. Ma's going to be disappointed. She'll be mad and disappointed." Al said, "When you think we're going to go, Pa?" "I don't know. We'll talk her over tonight and decide. I'm sure glad Tom's back. That makes me feel good. Tom's a good boy." Al said, "Pa, some fellas was talking about Tom, and they say he's parole, and they say that means he can't go outside the state, or if he goes and they catch him, they send him back for 3 years." Pa looked startled. "They said that? Seemed like fellas that knowed, not just blowing off." "I don't know," said Al. "They was just a talking there, and I didn't let on he's my brother. I just stood and took it in." Pa said, "Jesus Christ, I hope that ain't true. We need Tom. I'll ask him about that. We got trouble enough without they chased the hell out of us. I hope it ain't true. We got to talk that out in the open." Uncle John said, "Tom, he'll know." They fell silent while the truck battered along. The engine was noisy, full of little clashing, and the brake rods banged. There was a wooden creaking from the wheel. and a thin jet of steam escaped through a hole in the top of the radiator cap. The truck pulled a high whirling column of red dust behind it. They rumbled up the last little rise while the sun was still half-faced above the horizon, and they bore down on the house as it disappeared. The brakes squealed when they stopped, and the sound printed in Al's head, no lining left. Ruthie and Winfield climbed, yelling over the side walls, and dropped to the ground. They shouted, "Where is he? Where's Tom?" And then they saw him, standing beside the door, and they stopped, embarrassed, and walking slowly towards him, looked shyly at him. And when he said, "Hello, how you kids doing?" they replied softly, "Hello, all right." And they stood apart and watched him secretly. The great brother who had killed a man and had been in prison. They remembered how they had played prison in the chicken coop and fought for the right to be prisoner. Connie Rivers lifted the high tailgate out of the truck and got down and helped Rose of Sharon to the ground, and she accepted nobly, smiling her wise, self-satisfied smile, mouth tipped at the corners, a little fatuously. Tom said, "Why, it's Rose of Sharon. I didn't know you was comin' with them." "We was walking," she said. "That truck come by and picked us up." And then she said, "This is Connie, my husband." She was grand, saying it. The two shook hands, sizing each other up, looking deeply into each other in a moment, each was satisfied. And Tom said, "Well, I seen you been busy." She looked down. "You do not see, not yet. Pa told me." "Hey, when's it gonna be?" "Oh, not for long. Not till next winter." Tom laughed. "Gonna get him born a orange ranch, huh? In one of them white houses with orange trees all around." Rose of Sharon felt her stomach with both hands. "You do not see," she said, and she smiled her complacent smile and went into the house. The evening was hot, and the thrust of light still flowed up the west horizon, and without any signal, the family gathered by the truck, and the Congress, the family government, went into session. The film of the evening light made the red earth loosen, so that its dimensions were deepened, so that a stone, a post, a building had greater depth and more solidity than in the daytime light, and these objects were curiously more individual. A post was more essentially a post, set off from the earth it stood in, and the field of corn it stood out against. All plants were individuals, not the mass of crop, and the ragged willow tree was itself, standing free of all other willow trees. The earth contributed a light to the evening. The front of the gray, paintless house facing the west was luminous as the moon is. The gray, dusty truck in the yard before the door stood out magically in this light, in the overdrawn perspective of a stereopticon. The people were changed in the evening, quieted. They seemed to be a part of an organization of the unconscious. They obeyed impulses which registered only faintly in their thinking minds. Their eyes were inward and quiet, and their eyes, too, were lucent in the evening, lucent in dusty faces. The family met at the most important place, near the truck. The house was dead, and the fields were dead, but this truck was the most active thing, the living principle. The ancient Hudson, with bent and scarred radiator screen, with grease in the dusty globules at the worn edge of every moving part, with hubcaps gone and caps of red dust in their places. This was the new hearth, the living center of the family, half passenger car and half truck, high-sided and clumsy. Pa walked around the truck, looking at it, and then he squatted down in the dust and found a stick to draw with. One foot was flat to the ground, the other rested on the ball and slightly back, so that one knee was higher than the other. Left forearm rested on the lower left knee, the right elbow on the right knee, and the right fist cupped for the chin. Pa squatted there, looking at the truck, his chin in his cupped fist, and Uncle John moved toward him and squatted down beside him. Their eyes were brooding. Grandpa came out of the house and saw the two squatting there, and he jerked over and sat on the running board of the truck facing them. That was the nucleus. Tom and Connie and Noah strolled in and squatted, and the line was a half circle with Grandpa in the opening. And Ma came out of the house, and Grandma with her, and Rose and Sharon behind, walking daintily. They took their places behind the squatting men. They stood up and put their hands on their hips, and the children, Ruthie and Winfield, hopped from foot to foot beside the woman. The children squidged their toes in the red dust, but they made no sound. Only the preacher was not there. He, out of delicacy, was sitting on the ground behind the house. He was a good preacher and knew his people. The evening light grew softer, and for a while the family sat and stood silently. Then Pa, speaking to no one but to the group, made his report. Got skinned on the stuff we sold. That fellow knowed we couldn't wait. Got $18 only. Ma stirred restively, but she held her peace. Noah, the oldest son, asked, "How much? I'll add it up. We got." Pa drew figures in the dust and mumbled to himself for a moment. "154, he said. "But Al here says we gonna need better tires. Says these here won't last." This was Al's first participation in the conference. Always he had stood behind the woman before. Now he made his report solemnly. "She's old and she's ornery," he said gravely. "I gave the whole thing a good going over 'fore we bought her. Didn't listen to the fella talking what a hell of a bargain she was. Stuck my finger in the differential, and they wasn't no sawdust. Opened the gearbox, and they wasn't no sawdust. Tested her clutch and rolled her wheels for line. Went under her, and her frame ain't splayed none. She never been rolled. Seen they was a cracked cell in her battery, and made the fella put in a good one. The tires ain't worth a damn, but they're a good size. Easy to get. She'll ride like a bull calf, but she ain't shooting no oil. Reason I says buy her is she was a popular car. Wrecking Yards is full of Hudson Super 6s, and you can buy her parts cheap. Could have got a bigger, fancier car for the same money, but parts too hard to get and too dear. That's how I figured her anyway." This was the last was his submission to the family. He stopped speaking and waited for their opinions. Grandpa was still the titular head, but he no longer ruled. His position was honorary and a matter of custom, but he did have the right of the first comment, no matter how silly his old mind might be. And the squatting man and the standing woman waited for him. "You're right, Al," Grandpa said. "I was a squirt, just like you, a farting around like dog wolf. But when they was a job, I done it. You've growed up good." He finished in the tone of a benediction, and Al reddened a little with pleasure. Pa said, "Sounds right side up to me. If it was horses, we wouldn't have to put the blame on Al. But Al's the only automobile fella here." Tom said, "I know some. Worked some in McAllister. Al's right. He done good." And now Al was rosy with the compliment. Tom went on, "I'd like to say, well, that preacher, he wants to go along." He was silent. His words lay in the group, and the group was silent. "He's a nice fellow," Tom added. "We known him a long time. Talks a little wild sometimes, but he talks sensible." And he relinquished the proposal to the family. The light was gradually going. Ma left the house and went in. Ma left the group and went into the house, and the iron clang of the stove came from the house. In a moment, she walked back to the brooding council. Grandpa said, "There was two ways of thinking. Some folks used to figure that preacher was poison luck." Tom said, "This fella, he says he ain't a preacher no more." Grandpa waved his hand back and forth. "Once a fella's a preacher, he's always a preacher. That's something you can't get shut of. They was some folks figured it was a good respectable thing to have a preacher along. If somebody died, preacher buried him. Wedding come due or overdue, and there's your preacher. Baby come, and you got a Christianer right under the roof. Me, I always said they was preachers and preachers. Got to pick. I kinda like this fella. He ain't stiff. Pa dug a stick into the dust and rolled it between his fingers so that it bored a little hole. They's more to this than is he lucky or is he a nice fella, Pa said. We got to figure it close. It's a sad thing to figure close. Let's see now. There's Grandpa and Grandma, that's 2, and me and John and Ma, that's 5, and Noah and Tommy and Al, that's 8. Brother Sharon and Connie is 10, and Ruthie and Winfield is 12. We got to take dogs, because what else? What'll we do else? Can't shoot a good dog, and there ain't nobody to give him to. And that's 14, not counting what chickens is left, and 2 pigs, said Noah. Pa said, I aim to get those pigs salted down to eat on the way. We gonna need meat. Carry the salt kegs right with us. But I'm wondering if we can all ride, and the preacher, too. And can we feed an extra mouth without turning his head? Yes. Can we, Ma? Ma cleared her throat. It ain't can we, it's will we, she said firmly. As far as can, we can't do nothing. Not to go to California or nothing. But as far as will, why, we'll do what we will. And as far as will, it's a long time our folks been here in East before, and I never heard tell of no Jodes or no Haslets, neither, ever refusing food and shelter or a lift on the road to anybody that asked. They's been mean Jodes, but never that mean. Pa broke in. But suppose there just ain't room? He had twisted his neck to look up at her, and he was ashamed. Her tone made him ashamed. Suppose we just can't all get in the truck? There ain't room now, she said. There ain't room for more than 6, and 12 is going for sure. One more ain't gonna hurt, and a man strong and healthy ain't never no burden. And any time when we got 2 pigs and over $100 and we wondering if we can feed a fella, she stopped and Pa turned back, and his spirit was raw from the whipping. Grandma said, a preacher is a nice thing to be with us. He give a nice grace this morning. Pa looked at the face of each one for dissent, and then he said, want to call him over, Tommy? If he's going, he ought to be here. Tom got up from his hams and went towards the house, calling, Casey, oh Casey! A muffled voice replied from behind the house. Tom walked to the corner and saw the preacher sitting back against the wall, looking at the flashing evening star in the light sky. Calling me? Casey asked. Yeah, we think as long as you're going with us, you ought to be over with us, helping to figure things out. Casey got to his feet. He knew the government of families, and he knew he had been taken into the family. Indeed, his position was eminent, for Uncle John moved sideways, leaving space between Pa and himself for the preacher. Casey squatted down like the others, facing Grandpa enthroned on the running board. Ma went to the house again. There was a screech of a lantern hood, and the yellow light flashed up in the dark kitchen. When she lifted the lid of the big pot, the smell of some boiling side meat and beet greens came out the door. They waited for her to come back across the darkening yard, for Ma was powerful in the group. Pa said, we got to figure when to start. Sooner the better. What we got to do before we go is get them pigs slaughtered and in salt, and pack our stuff and go. Quicker the better. Now. Noah agreed. If we pitch in, we can get ready tomorrow, and we can go bright the next day. Uncle John objected. Can't chill no meat in the heat of the day. Wrong time of year for slaughtering. Meat'll be soft if it done chill. Well, let's do her tonight. She'll chill tonight some. Much as she's gonna. After we eat, let's get her done. Got salt? Ma said yes. Got plenty salt. Got 2 nice kegs too. Well, let's get her done then, said Tom. Grandpa began to scrabble about, trying to get a purchase to arise. Getting dark, he said. I'm getting hungry. Come time we get to California, I'll have a big bunch of grapes in my hand all the time, a nibbling off it all the time, by God. He got up, and the men rose. Ruthie and Winfield hopped excitedly in the dusk, like crazy things. Ruthie whispered hoarsely to Winfield, "Killing pigs and going to California? Killing pigs and going, all at the same time?" And Winfield was reduced to madness. He stuck his finger against his throat, made a horrible face, and wobbled about, weakly shrilling, "I'm an old pig. Look, I'm an old pig. Look at the blood, Ruthie." And he staggered and sank into the ground and waved his arms and legs weakly. But Ruthie was older, and she knew the tremendousness of the time. "And going to California," she said again. And she knew this was the great time in her life so far. The adults moved towards the lighted kitchen through the deep dusk, and Ma served them greens and side meat in tin plates. Before she put the big round wash tub on the stove and started the fire to roaring. She carried buckets of water until the tub was full, and then around the tub she clustered the buckets full of water. The kitchen became a swamp of heat, and the family ate hurriedly and went out to sit on the doorstep until the water should get hot. They sat looking out at the dark, at the square light the kitchen lantern threw on the ground outside the door, with a hunched shadow of Grandpa in the middle of it. Noah picked his teeth thoroughly with a broom straw. Ma and Rose Sharon washed up the dishes and piled them on the table. And then, all of a sudden, the family began to function. Pa got up and lighted another lantern. Noah, from a box in the kitchen, brought out the bow-bladed butchering knife and whetted it on a worn little carborundum stone, and he laid the scraper on the chopping block and the knife beside it. Pa brought 2 sturdy sticks, each 3 feet long, and pointed the ends with the axe. And he tied strong ropes, double half-hitched, to the middle of the sticks. He grumbled, "Shouldn't have sold those single trees, all of them. The water in the pot steamed and rolled." Noah asked, "Gonna take the water down there or bring the pigs up here?" "Pigs up here," said Pa. "You can't spill a pig and scald yourself like you can hot water. Water about ready?" "Just about," said Ma. "All right. Noah, you and Tom and Al come along. I'll carry the light. We'll slaughter down there and bring 'em up here." Noah took his knife and Al the axe, and the 4 men moved down on the sty, their legs flickering in the lantern light. Ruthie and Winfield skittered along, hopping over the ground. At the sty, Pa leaned over the fence, holding the lantern. The sleepy young pigs struggled to their feet, grunting suspiciously. Uncle John and the preacher walked down to help. "All right," said Pa. "Stick 'em and we'll run 'em up." And Bleed and scowled at the house. Noah and Tom stepped over the fence. They slaughtered quickly and efficiently. Tom struck twice with the blunt head of the axe, and Noah, leaning over the felled pigs, found the great artery with his curving knife, and released the pulsing streams of blood. Then, over the fence with the squealing pigs. The preacher and Uncle John dragged one by the hind legs, and Tom and Noah the other. Pa walked along with his lantern, and the black blood made 2 trails in the dust. At the house, Noah slipped his knife between the tendon and bone of the hind legs. The pointed sticks held the legs apart, and the carcasses were hung from the 2x4 rafters that stuck out from the house. Then the men carried the boiling water and poured it over the black bodies. Noah slit the bodies from end to end and dropped the entrails out onto the ground. Pa sharpened 2 more sticks to hold the bodies open to the air, while Tom with the scrubber and Ma with the dull knife scraped the skins to take out the bristles. Al brought a bucket and shoveled the entrails into them and dumped them on the ground away from the horse, and 2 cats followed him, mewing loudly. The dogs followed him, growling lightly at the cats. Pa sat on the doorstep and looked at the pigs hanging in the lantern light. The scraping was done now. Only a few drops of blood continued to fall from the carcass into the black pool on the ground. Pa got up and went to the pigs and felt them with his hand, and then he sat down again. Grandma and Grandpa went toward the barn to sleep, and Grandpa carried a candle lantern in his hand. The rest of the family sat quietly about the doorstep. Connie and Al and Tom on the ground, leaning their backs against the house wall, Uncle John on a box, Pa in the doorway. Only Ma and Rose Sharon continued to move about. Ruthie and Winfield were sleepy now, but fighting enough. They quarreled sleepily out in the darkness. Noah and the preacher squatted side by side, facing the house. Pa scratched himself nervously and took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. Tomorrow we'll get that pork salted early in the morning, and then we'll get the truck loaded, but all but the beds. And next morning off we go. We'll go. Hardly is a day's work in all that, he said uneasily. Tom broke in. We'll be mooning around all day, looking for something to do. The group stirred uneasily. We could get ready by daylight and go, Tom suggested. Pa rubbed his knee with his hand, and the restiveness spread to all of them. Noah said, probably wouldn't hurt that meat to get her down in salt. Cut her up, she'll cool quicker anyways. It was Uncle John who broke over the edge. His pressure's too great. What are we hanging around for? I want to get shut of this. Now we're going, why don't we go? And the revulsion spread to the rest. Why don't we go? Get asleep on the way. And a sense of hurry crept into them. Pa said, they say it's 2,000 miles. That's a hell of a long ways. We ought to go. Noah, you and me can get that meat cut up, and we can put all the stuff in the truck. Ma put her head out the door. How about if we forget something, not seeing it in the dark? We could look round after daylight. They sat still, then, thinking about it. But in a moment, Noah got up and began to sharpen the bow-bladed knife on his little worn stone. Ma, he said, get that table cleared. And he stepped to a pig, cut a line down one side of the backbone, and began peeling meat forward off the ribs. Pa stood up excitedly. We gotta get the stuff together. Come on, you fellas. Now that they were committed to going, the hurry infected all of them. Noah carried slabs of meat into the kitchen and cut it into small salting blocks, and Ma patted coarse salt in them, laid it piece by piece in the kegs, careful that no two pieces touched each other. She laid the slabs like bricks, and pounded salt in the spaces. And Noah cut up the side meat, and he cut up the legs. Ma kept her fire going, and as Noah cleaned the ribs and the spines and the leg bones of all the meat he could, she put them in the oven to roast for gnawing purposes. In the yard and in the barn, the circles of lantern light moved about, and the men brought together all the things to be taken and piled them by the truck. Rose Sharon brought out all the clothes the family possessed, the overalls, the thick-soled shoes, the rubber boots, the worn best suits, the sweaters, and the sheepskin coats. And she packed these tightly into a wooden box and got into the box, tramped them down. And then she brought out the print dresses and shawls and the black cotton stockings and the children's clothes, small overalls and cheap print dresses, and she put these in a box and tramped them down. Tom went to the tool shed and brought what tools were left to go. A handsaw, a set of wrenches, a hammer, and a box of assorted nails, a pair of pliers, and a flat file, and a set of rat-tailed files. And Rosa Sharon brought out the big piece of tarpaulin and spread it on the ground behind the truck. She struggled through the door with the mattresses, the three double ones, and a single. She piled them on the tarpaulin and brought armloads of folded ragged blankets and piled them up. Ma and Noah worked busily at the carcasses, and the smell of roasting pork bones came from the stove. The children had fallen, by the way, in the late night. Winfield lay curled in the dust outside the door, and Ruthie sitting on a box in the kitchen, where she had gone to watch the butchering, and dropped her head back against the wall. She breathed easily in her sleep, and her lips were parted over her teeth. Tom finished with the tools and came into the kitchen with his lantern, and the preacher followed him. "God in a buckboard," Tom said. "Smell that meat and listen to her crackle." Ma laid bricks of meat in a keg and poured salt around and over them, and covered the layer with salt and patted it down. She looked up at Tom and smiled a little at him, but her eyes were serious and tired. "Be nice to have pork bones for breakfast," she said. The preacher stepped beside her. "Leave me salt down this meat," he said. "I can do it. There's other stuff for you to do." She stopped her work and then inspected him oddly, as though he suggested a curious thing. And her hands were crusted with salt, pink with fluid from the fresh pork. "It's woman's work," she said finally. "It's all work," the preacher replied. "There's too much of it to split it up to men's or woman's work. You got stuff to do. Leave me salt the meat." Still, for a moment, she stared at him, and then she poured the water from a bucket into the tin wash basin, and she washed her hands. The preacher took up the box of pork and patted them on the salt while she watched him, and he laid them in the kegs as she had. Only when he had finished a layer and covered it carefully and patted down the salt was she satisfied. She dried her bleached and bloated hands. Tom said, "Ma, what stuff we gonna take from here?" She looked quickly about the kitchen. "The bucket," she said. "All the stuff to eat with. Plates and the cups and the spoons and knives and forks. Put all them in that drawer. And take the drawer. The big fry pan and the big stew kettle. The coffee pot. When it gets cool, take the rack out of the oven. That's good over a fire. I'd like to take the wash tub, but I guess there ain't room. I'll wash clothes in the bucket. Don't do no good to take little stuff. You can cook little stuff in a big kettle, but you can't cook big stuff in a little pot. Take the bread pans, all of them. They fit down inside each other." She stood and looked about the kitchen. "You just take stuff I told you, Tom. I'll fix up the rest. The big can of pepper and the salt and the nutmeg and the grater. I'll take all that stuff just at the last." She picked up a lantern and walked heavily into the bedroom. Her bare feet made no sound on the floor. The preacher said, "She looks tired." "A woman always looks tired," said Tom. "That's just the way a woman is, except at meeting once and again." "Yeah, but tireder than that. Real tired, like she's sick tired." Ma was just through the door, and she heard his words. Slowly, her relaxed face tightened, and the lines disappeared from the taut, muscular face. Her eyes sharpened, and her shoulders straightened. She glanced about the stripped room. Nothing was left in it except trash. The mattresses which had been on the floor were gone. The bureaus were sold. On the floor lay a broken comb, an empty talcum powder can, and a few dust mice. Ma set her lantern on the floor. She reached behind one of those boxes that had served as chairs and brought out a stationery box, old and soiled and cracked at the corners. She sat down and opened the box. Inside were letters, clippings, photographs, a pair of earrings, a little gold signet ring, and a watch chain braided of hair and tipped with gold swivels. She touched the letters with her fingers, touched them lightly, and she smoothed a newspaper clipping on it, on which there was an account of Tom's trial. For a long time she held the box, looking over it, and her fingers disturbed the letters, and then lined them up again. She bit her lower lip, thinking, remembering, and at last she made up her mind. She picked out the ring, the watch charm, the earrings, dug under the pile, and found one gold cufflink. She took a letter from an envelope and dropped the trinkets in the envelope. Then, gently and tenderly, she closed the box, smoothed the top carefully with her fingers. Her lips parted, and she stood up, took her lantern, went back into the kitchen. She lifted the stove lid and laid the box gently among the coals. Quickly, the heat browned the paper. The flame licked up and over the box. She replaced the stove lid, and instantly fire sighed and breathed over the box. Out in the dark yard, working in the lantern light, Pa now loaded the truck. Tools on the bottom, but handy to reach in case of breakdown. Boxes of clothes and eggs, and kitchen utensils in the gunny sack. Cutlery and dishes in their box, then a gallon bucket tied on behind. They made the bottom of the load as even as possible, and filled the spaces between boxes with rolled blankets. Then, over the top, they laid the mattress, filling the truck in level. And last, they spread the big tarpaulin over the load, and Al made holes in the edge, set 2 feet apart, and inserted little ropes, and tied it down to the sidebars of the truck. Now, if it rains, he says, we'll tie it to the bar above, and the folks can get underneath, out of the wet. Up front will be dry enough. Pa applauded. That's a good idea. That ain't all, Al said. First chance I get, I'm gonna find a long plank and make a ridgepole and put the tarp over that, and then it'll be covered in, and the folks will be out of the sun too. And Pa agreed. That's a good idea. Why didn't you think of that before? I ain't had time, said Al. You ain't had time? Well, why, Al, you had time to coyote all over the country. God knows where you've been this last 2 weeks. Stuff a fellow got to do when he's leaving the country, said Al, and then he lost some of his assurance. Pa, he asked, you glad to be going, Pa? Huh? Well, sure, leastwise, yeah. We had hard times here. Of course, it'll be all different out there. Plenty of work and everything nice and green, and little white houses and oranges growing around. Is it oranges everywhere? Well, maybe not everywhere, but plenty of places. The first gray of daylight began in the sky, and the work was done. The kegs of pork ready, and the chicken coop ready to go on top. Ma opened the oven and took out the pile of roasted bones, crisp and brown, with plenty of gnawing meat left. Ruthie half awakened and slipped down from the box and slept again. But the adults stood around the door, shivering a little and gnawing at the crisp pork. Guess we ought to wake up Grandma and Grandpa, Tom said, getting along toward day. Ma said, kinda hate to, till the last minute. They need the sleep. Ruthie and Winfield ain't hardly got no real rest, neither. Well, they can sleep on top of the load, said Pa. It'll be nice and comfortable there. Suddenly the dog started up from the dust and listened. Then, with a roar, went barking off into the darkness. Now, what in the hell's that? Pa demanded. In a moment, they heard a voice speaking reassuringly to the barking dogs, and the barking lost its fierceness. Then, footsteps, and a man approaches. It was Willie Graves, his hat pulled down low. He came near timidly. Mornin', folks, he said. Why, Willie. Pa waved the ham bone he held. Step in and get some pork for yourself, Willie. Well, no, said Willie. I ain't hungry, exactly. Oh, get it, Willie, get it. Here. And Pa stepped into the house and brought out a hand of spare ribs. I wasn't aiming to eat none of your stuff, he said. I was just walking around, and I thought how you'd been going, and I'd maybe say goodbye. Going in a little while now, said Pa. You'd have missed us if you'd come an hour later. All packed up, see? All packed up. Molly looked at the loaded truck. Sometimes I wished I'd go and find my folks. Ma here asked. Didn't you hear from them out in California? No, said Molly. I ain't heard. But I ain't been to look in the post office. I ought to go in sometime. Pa said, I'll go down, wake up Grandma and Grandpa. Tell 'em to come and eat. We're going before long. And as Al sauntered toward the barn, Molly, you want to squeeze in with us and go? We'd try to make room for ya. Molly took a bite out of the meat from the edge of a rib bone and chewed it. Sometimes I think I might, but I know I won't, he said. I know perfectly well. The last minute I'd run and hide like a damn old graveyard ghost. Noah said, "You're gonna die out in the field someday, Molly." I know. I thought about it. Sometimes it seems pretty lonely, and sometimes it seems alright, and sometimes it seems good. It don't make no difference. But if you come across my folks, that's really what I come to say. If you come on any of my folks in California, tell them I'm well. Tell them I'm doing all right. Don't let on that I'm living this way. Tell them I'll come to them as soon as I get the money. Ma asked, and will ya? No, Molly said softly. No, I won't. I can't go away. I got to stay now. Time back, I might have went as well, but not now. Fella gets to thinking, and he gets to knowing. I ain't never going. And the light of dawn was a little sharper now. It paled the lanterns a little. Al came back with Grandpa struggling and limping by his side. He wasn't sleeping, Al said. He was sitting out back of the barn. There's something wrong with him. Grandpa's eyes had dulled, and there was none of the old meanness in them. Ain't nothing matter with me, he said. I just ain't a-goin'. Not goin'? Pa demanded. What you mean you ain't a-goin'? Why, here we're all packed up and ready. We got to go. We got no place to stay. I ain't staying for you to stay, said Grandpa. You go right along. Me, I'm staying. I give her a going over all night mostly. This here is my country. I belong here. And I don't give a goddamn if there's any oranges and grapes crowding fellows out of bed even. I ain't a-going. This country ain't no good, but it's my country. No, if you all go ahead, I'll just stay right here where I belong. They crowded near to him. Pa said, You can't, Grandpa. This here land is going under the tractors. Who took for you? How did you live? You can't stay here. Why, with nobody to take care of you, you'd starve. Grandpa cried. God damn it. I'm an old man, but I can still take care of myself. How's Molly get here along? I can get along as good as him. I tell you, I ain't going, and you can't lump it. Take Grandma with you if you want, but you ain't taking me, and that's the end of it. Pa said helplessly. Now listen to me, Grandpa. Just listen to me, just a minute. Ain't a-gonna listen. I told you what I'm gonna do. Tom touched his father on the shoulder. Pa, come in the house. I want to tell you something. And as they moved towards the house, he called, Ma, come here a minute, will ya? And in the kitchen, one lantern burned, and the plate of pork bones was still piled high. Tom said, Listen, I know Grandma got the right to say he ain't going, but he can't stay. We know that. Sure he can't stay, said Pa. Well, look, if we got to catch him and tie him down, we liable to hurt him. And he'll get mad, so he'll hurt himself. Now, we can't argue with him. If we could get him drunk, it'd be all right. You got any whiskey? No, said Pa. There ain't a drop of whiskey in this house, and John got no whiskey. He never has none when he ain't drinking. Ma said, Tom, I got a half bottle of soothing syrup I got from for Winfield when he had them earaches. Think that might work? Used to put Winfield to sleep when his earache was bad. Might, said Tom. Get it, Ma. We'll give her a try anyway. I throwed it out on the trash pile, said Ma. She took the lantern and went out, and in a moment she came back with a bottle half full of black medicine. Tom took it from her and tasted it. Don't taste bad. Make a cup of black coffee, good and strong. Let's see, says 1 tablespoon. Better put in a lot, couple of tablespoons. Ma opened the stove and put a kettle inside, down next to the coals, and she measured water and coffee into it. Have to give it to him in a can. We got all the cups packed. Tom and his father went back outside. Fellow's got a right to say what he's gonna do. So, say, who's eating spare ribs? Said Grandpa. We've it, said Tom. Ma's fixing you a cup of coffee and some pork. He went into the house and he drank his coffee and ate his pork. The group outside in the growing dawn watched him quietly through the door. They saw him yawn and sway, and they saw him put his arms on the table and rest his head on his arm. Go to sleep. He was tired anyway, said Tom. Leave him be. Now they were ready. Grandma, giddy and vague, saying, What's all this? "What you doing now so early?" But she was dressed and agreeable, and Ruthie and Winfield were awake, but quiet with the pressure of tiredness and still half dreaming. The light was sifting rapidly over the land, and the movement of the family stopped. They stood about, reluctant to make the first active move to go. They were afraid, now that the time had come, afraid in the same way Grandpa was afraid. They saw the shed take shape against the light, and they saw the lanterns pale until they no longer cast their circles of yellow light. The stars went out, few by few, towards the west, and still the family stood about like dreamwalkers. Their eyes focused panoramically, seeing no detail but the whole dawn, the whole land, the whole texture of the country at once. Only Molly Graves prowled about restlessly, looking through the bars into the truck, thumping the spare tires hung on the back of the truck. And at last, Molly approached Tom. "You going over the state line?" he asked. "You gonna break your parole?" And Tom shook himself free of the numbness. "Jesus Christ, it's near sunrise," he said loudly. "We gotta get going." And the others came out of their numbness and moved toward the truck. "Come on," Tom said. "Let's get Grandpa on." Pa and Uncle John and Tom and Al went into the kitchen where Grandpa slept, his forehead down on his arms, and a line of drying coffee on the table. They took him under the elbow and lifted him to his feet, and he grumbled and cursed thickly, like a drunken man. Out the door they boosted him, and when they came to the truck, Tom and Al climbed up, and leaning over, hooked their hands under his arms and lifted him gently up, and laid him on top of the load. Al untied the tarpaulin, and they rolled him under and put a box under the tarp beside him, so that the weight of the heavy canvas would not be upon him. "I got to get that ridgepole fixed," Al said. "Do her tonight when we stop." Grandpa grunted and fought weakly against the awakening, and when he was finally settled, he went deeply to sleep again. Pa said, "Ma, you and Grandma set in with Al for a while. We'll change around so it's easier, but you start out that way." They got into the cab, and the rest swarmed onto the top of the load. Connie and Rose, Sharon, Pa and Uncle John, Ruthie and Winfield, Tom and the preacher. Noah stood on the ground, looking up at the great load of them, sitting on the top of the truck. Al walked around, looking underneath at the springs. "Holy Jesus, them springs flat as hell. Luckily I blocked under them." Noah said, "How about the dogs, Pa?" "I forgot the dogs," Pa said. He whistled shrilly, and one bouncing dog ran in, but only one. Noah caught him and threw him up over the top, where he sat rigid and shivering at the height. Got to leave the other two," Pa said. "Molly, will you look after them so you see that they don't starve?" "Yeah," said Molly. "I'd like to have a couple of dogs." "Yeah, I'll take them." "Take them chickens, too," Pa said. Al got in the driver's seat, and the starter whirred and caught, and whirred again. And then the loose roar of the 6 cylinders and a blue smoke behind. "So long, Molly," Al called, and the family called, "Goodbye, Molly." Al slipped into the low gear and let in the clutch. The truck shuddered and strained across the yard, and the second gear took hold. They crawled up the hill, and the red dust arose about them. "Christ, what a load," said Al. "We ain't making this trip." Ma tried to look back, but the body of the load cut off her view. She straightened her head and peered straight ahead along the dirt road, and a great weariness was in her eyes. The people on top of the load did look back. They saw the house and the barn, and a little smoke still rising from the chimney. They saw the windows reddening under the first color of the sun. They saw Molly standing forlornly in the dooryard, looking after them. And then the hill cut them off. The cotton fields lined the road, and the truck crawled slowly through the dust towards the highway in the west.